All right, so welcome again to this afternoon session. This is the overview for the K4Me program, instructional program. And I'm going to bring up some slides on the screen that will guide our time together this afternoon. Before we get too far along, I'm really interested in a couple of things. One being, what has piqued your interest about learning about K4Me? And if you wouldn't mind just putting a quick note in the chat box to share that interest, that would be great. And while you're doing that, I'm going to just talk briefly about our agenda for our time together this afternoon. So first, we'll start with a few purposes for the overview today. I want to give a little synopsis of the history of Maine's work related to this program and what's gotten us to where we are today. And then we'll walk through the components of K4Me and talk about how they work together. We'll look at a sample of a K4Me schedule, talk a little bit about what classroom environments look like, some opportunities for some training this summer, and then some additional resources that you may want to explore as you are learning more about K4Me and potentially contemplating adopting it or testing it out in your own classrooms. So that should probably fill up our time together pretty readily. So I'm just going to do a quick look at the chat box. And I see that some folks are already using pre-K4Me and maybe thinking about where do our children go after experiencing pre-K4Me, which is our open education resource preschool curriculum that we posted a couple of years ago. And I see others have had maybe a heads up from folks who've learned about K4Me. That transition is certainly really important to think about, kids coming from pre-K and into kindergarten. Sounds like someone heard about it maybe at a conference. Looking for some ideas related to instructional programs that are have a database or an evidence base behind them. Great. So I'm hopeful that we're going to touch on many of those pieces, and certainly if by the time we get to the end, your questions have not been answered, we'll make time for those questions because those are certainly very important. So to kick us off, we're hoping that this overview session will provide you with an opportunity to learn about the Department of Education's work in developing the K4Me instructional program. We'll also talk about the design, the structure, the components of this interdisciplinary program, opportunities for you to be able to learn more and to dive into it. And then, as I said, some time for questions and answers. So why K4Me? Why was the department interested in pursuing this particular program of instruction? So there are a number of reasons that have really where we are today. One that has been particularly at the forefront is that we know that many schools in our state are looking for both interdisciplinary curricula to use with their students, as well as programs of instruction that are not as costly to be able to adopt, that are developmentally appropriate for youngsters, especially in the early elementary years. We are keenly aware of the importance of explicit and intentional instruction happening in our classrooms, making sure that there is a sequence of skills and concepts that children are learning over time, but that those learning experiences are happening through effective teaching practices, including, especially at this age, purposeful play and project-based experiences. And we're also vitally aware of how important it is to be able to honor children's voices and agency within the curriculum. So several years ago, as we had been expanding public pre-K in our state, we had begun to explore the work that had been going on in the Boston public schools since the early 2000s, related to the development of some instructional programming that they had been building across the pre-K to grade 2 span. And at the time, we were most interested in the pre-K curriculum from Boston. Boston had adopted public pre-K back around 2005. They started out using a program called Opening a World of Learning, as well as Building Blocks, which is a math program. They had done a lot of work at getting their pre-K programs accredited through NAEYC, but they reached a point where they had begun to realize that if they didn't think about the programming once kids were leaving their preschools, that was a real shortcoming for the outcomes they were looking for their youngsters. And so they began to build out a kindergarten, first and second grade curriculum. Eventually, their access to OWL, or the Opening World of Learning curriculum, in order to keep using it, because that program had shifted to a more recent edition, Boston was able to actually secure the rights to the original curriculum, and then they took that and tweaked it to make it what we actually used to build pre-K for Me. But in following their work, Boston had done a considerable amount of research looking at the outcomes that they were seeing for their children, particularly through pre-K for Me and K for Me. And in fact, their curricula are in the midst of a longitudinal study through the Institute for Educational Sciences at the current time, which is coming to an end in about another year. Anyway, it led us to want to investigate better some of the results that they were seeing, and wondering if this might be a good fit for us in Maine. And in particular, because of our expansion of pre-K, we wanted to be able to offer schools a curriculum that would be an open educational resource, perhaps something a little bit more cost-effective, and at the same time high quality, and have an evidence base behind it. So we spent a year piloting the Boston pre-K curriculum, but at the same time we were piloting it, we were also working on tweaking it to have more of a Maine context, because obviously a Boston-based curriculum uses lots of examples that are specific to the context in Boston. And we wanted to make sure that the curricula that we were building out would be reflective of our Maine context for students here in our state. So we worked on that, and were able to post pre-K for Me as an open education resource in 2019. And while we were involved in that initial pilot, we had a number of schools express an interest in the kindergarten curriculum from Boston. So we were fortunate that we had some seed money left from a grant that enabled us to be able to start a pilot in 2019-20 with 5 school systems across the state, 14 kindergarten classrooms that joined us on the journey. And we began to pilot K for Me, which is actually referred to as the K2 curricula in Boston, if you look it up. We call it K4Me. And while we have been piloting it, we were collecting feedback from the educators in the pilot to help us make some tweaks to fit Maine's context. Unfortunately, COVID struck in March of last year, and that meant that our pilot had to come to kind of a halt for a bit. So we were fortunate again to get a little bit more grant money to be able to extend that pilot through this school year, which we have been doing. And the schools that were involved in the pilot originally asked if it would be possible to extend the pilot out to some of their other classrooms. So this second year of piloting K4Me, we've had 28 classrooms involved, and we also added an evaluation component this year that we will be receiving next month. They're still in the midst of gathering some of that information, but all with the intention that by this August, we will be able to post K4Me as an open education resource for use by schools in our state. So now that we've reached this point, we felt like it was a good time to start introducing this on a larger scale so that schools can get to know what K4Me is all about and start to think about whether or not this might be a good fit for them in their own instructional programming. So with all of that said, we're going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to take a look at what the design of K4Me is like, what it involves, some of how it's laid out across a year, and what it would look like, if you were implementing this in a classroom. So a few things that are very important to keep in mind are some of the foundational principles on which K4Me is built. First off, young children are capable of complex, higher order thinking. That is really foundational. The curriculum unfolds by really watching and taking cues from young learners. There's definitely a scope and sequence laid out, but children are expected to be active participants in their learning and to be able to self-select and self-direct a lot of their learning within this instructional program. We also have built this recognizing that children construct knowledge through the interactions and the engaging high quality activities in which they are involved throughout the day. And that instruction is really impactful because teachers become researchers for their own classrooms. They're watching and observing and taking cues from children and thinking about where they're headed next and how those interactions can really help move learning forward. So those are all just important pieces that we want to make sure folks recognize when you begin to dive in and look at how the program is structured. Something else that's really important to say on the onset is that K4Me is very much an interdisciplinary set of units of study. English language arts, science, social studies, visual and performing arts, some aspects of health, and social emotional learning are all incorporated in the design of the instructional program. But that said, there are two pieces that schools do need to add that wouldn't be explicitly covered through the program. One of them is a phonics/phonemic awareness program. That's a very critical piece that has to be added to the design of K4Me. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. And as we look at how the components unfold and how a day unfolds, you'll begin to see, where that piece would fit in. Additionally, unlike pre-K4Me that we were able to invest in building out a math program that could be incorporated right within pre-K4Me, In K for Me, schools would add their own math program to the course of the day. So those two pieces are additions that schools would need to plan for. So the K for Me curriculum, as I mentioned, is built around units of study. In pre-K for Me, there are more units of study than in K for Me. In K for Me, the units of study are a little bit longer because as kids are getting older, they're able to sustain around a topic or a unit of study for a bit of a longer period. So it's constructed around 4 big units of study. The first of which is called Our Community. And this is where students are getting the chance to really explore how communities work. In particular, at the start of the year, as all of you are well aware, there's a lot of attention to just how we interact with one another within a community of learners. But it takes kids thinking broader than that out to thinking about the larger community. There's beyond the classroom into the school community, their local community, and they're building a lot of skills and understanding about what it means to be part of a community. That whole notion of community you'll see run across the rest of the units. In the second unit of study, the focus is around animals and habitats. Kids dive deeply into animals that they probably know something about and animals they probably don't know a whole lot about. But they look at how that concept of habitat is an extension of a community for animals. They're exploring in particular animals here within our state and thinking about that aspect. Part of the work of this unit is to develop a showcase that they will then present to their families and others from the school. So they're working together to showcase their learning in this unit. They move on from there into construction, where they look at all kinds of different aspects of what it means to construct something. And that also pulls in learning from the previous units, as well as getting them to think more broadly. The project that they're working towards in the construction unit is working to design something that would actually benefit their larger community. So they work to identify what some needs are in their larger community and actually construct a project that would respond to one of those areas. In the final unit of the year, which is called Our Earth, students are exploring lots of concepts related to growing and changing, but also sustainability of our Earth. And so they're thinking about how the decisions that they make impact our Earth and our communities. So woven within all of these units are lots of opportunities for growing and students' knowledge and understanding of English language arts skills, science studies. All of those are just interwoven very smoothly and seamlessly through the units. Within each of the units, there's a set of components that kids experience on a daily basis. And this is how the units are able to take shape. The first of those components is really focused around the notion of centers. And what I think is important to clarify here is that there's actually 2 times of the day where you would find kids in kindergarten classrooms using this program of instruction in what we might consider centers or station time in typical classrooms, but they have different purposes and they operate a little bit differently from each other. One of them is center time. The other that we'll talk about in a few minutes is literacy stations time. In center time, This is very much a self-directed time of the day for children. And the centers are all constructed around the unit of study. Center time in its totality takes about 90 minutes to do in its entirety. It starts with about 10 minutes of introduction to centers where teachers are setting up the context and working with children to introduce the centers, to help them think and plan about what they might do, where they might want to go. There's a 60 minutes of the day that is focused on children actually being in center time, and they get the opportunity to move fluidly through centers. So they may start in one center but move on to a different center, but they can help self-direct that. Obviously, one of the things teachers work on is setting up some structure to that. So some centers may only be able to accommodate a certain number of kids at a time, but you work on routines within the classroom to help kids know how they can get a turn in a center, how you can watch to see when a space opens up, and teachers work to make sure that kids get a chance to get to different centers over time. At the end of center time, there's something called thinking and feedback, and this is an opportunity for teachers to help children reflect on the learning that happened during centers. One of the things that is really important for teachers to during this time is how they will intentionally interact with children during center time. Much of the learning that's happening is a result of the interactions of children with each other, but also with the teacher, who is asking questions, making observations, children's thinking. It's also important to point out that during center time, this is where some of those pieces of interdisciplinary learning are happening quite readily. One of the centers that you will frequently see within the classroom is the art studio. So certainly that's an opportunity for children to be engaged in visual and performing arts, as is the dramatization center. Blocks is another standard center during center time, writing and drawing. The STEM and Discovery Center is really pivotal because that's one of the ways in which the science strand is carried through. And that's actually a time where teachers might do a little bit of small group instruction, that kids would rotate and get to that center depending upon what the concept is that's being worked on in particular units of study. There's also a library and listening center. And then at times there may be other centers that are established depending on the unit of study that's happening. In addition to center time, other components of the curriculum that are absolutely essential include the read aloud. That is generally about a 20-minute block of time during the day, and this is where children are engaged in listening to a text read aloud. They will usually hear each text at least several times throughout the course of the week. There's usually a different text used each week. It's through those texts that a lot of the concepts that are being built out in the unit of study are being introduced and discussed. It's also an opportunity to very intentionally build children's vocabulary and comprehension skills within the unit. Storytelling and story acting is another component. This is one that builds on children's love for stories and their language and literacy development, particularly thinking about how to compose or narrate or tell a story. Often it's something that they might dictate to a teacher, and then the teacher helps children to act it out. I will say that storytelling and story acting is probably one of the pieces of the instructional program that comes kind of, I don't want to say last in the rotation, but as teachers are becoming more confident in the various components, this might be one that they don't start off with, but gets introduced a little bit later as the year gets going. The phonics shared reading literacy stations and small group block of the day is about an hour of time. This is where kids receive explicit systematic instruction in phonics and phonemic awareness. And this is where the addition of a phonics phonemic awareness program to the curriculum is really important. Generally, we recommend about 20 minutes of time be spent on that. There's a shared reading component of the curriculum, and you link together the phonics instruction with that shared reading piece. So shared reading passages are used as a vehicle to help kids see how those phonics skills play out and as they're reading and engaging in shared reading, and the shared reading is very geared to the unit of study as well. That piece, the phonics and shared reading, generally takes about a half an hour. And then the other half an hour of the block is an opportunity for children to engage in literacy stations and in small group and reading instruction with a teacher. So the literacy stations, unlike the centers, are a little bit less self-directed for students. Generally, children will work through the centers over the course of the week so that they get to each one of the centers. And the activities are very deliberately planned for them to work on a variety of their literacy skills during those times. And then they work through small group instruction, not usually every day, but probably a couple times a week with their teachers, so that most of the time teachers will see a couple of different groups during that 30-minute block. There's also a writing component of the curriculum, and that takes another 30 minutes during the day for that piece. And then finally, the school adopted math program. Generally, you allocate about 60 minutes for that piece. All of those pieces together will pretty readily fill up a school day. And then usually most schools have some other type of special for some of their other content, like physical education, maybe library time, music, or an art program. So there's usually enough time in the daily schedule for that to occur as well. This next slide gives you a selection of some of the text, just photos from the texts that come from the very first unit of study in K4Me. There's a lot of familiar text. Some of you might know Abby Yo-Yo, Chrysanthemum, the name jar, but there's the literature that's used in this program is very rich, very suitable for reading multiple times to children, so that there's a lot of engagement and desire to go back and explore and investigate those texts. And they're laid out in a sequence that really helps the concepts for the unit build out upon each other. So when putting together a daily schedule, and I'm gonna go through this piece and then I'll stop for a minute to take some questions. But there are definitely some considerations that are important to take into account. One of which is that center time. The heart and soul of K4Me is really the center time. Children are just immersed in being able to explore, create, lead their own learning, act out, test out things that they've been hearing about, reading about, learning about in their classrooms. So positioning and making sure that there's enough time for centers is really vital when you're building out a schedule. The community building and social emotional time is pretty well threaded through. A lot of the routines and structures that are recommended help to target the social emotional aspects. but also to build a strong sense of community in the classroom. Many of the pilot classrooms have a small chunk of time still for a morning meeting where they kick off the day. So keeping that intact can be really helpful. A lot of times that can be woven nicely into either center time if you choose to start the day with that, or maybe that becomes the lead into the read aloud and then on to that literacy block of time. But very important piece as well. The storytelling, story acting piece tends to be the shortest piece of the day, and teachers find good success just kind of weaving that in where it can work for them. It may not happen every day, and it may be the kind of thing that, you know, they're gathering a story during center time, or maybe they gather it during even a small group opportunity, but then the acting out happens at another time. The literacy block really does need that 60 minutes, and so does the math block. So planning accordingly. And while you can break up, you know, you could separate the phonics and shared reading and have that at one time and do literacy stations and your small group at another. It tends to work well if you can keep those pieces intact, but it's not absolutely essential. This is just to give you a sense of how the whole program might unfold in the course of the day. Obviously, you know, you may not start school at 8:30. This is built on an 8:30 to 2:30 school day, but it gives you a little bit of a sense. You might begin with read aloud, and read aloud might be the springboard after that community of learners time into the center time. In some of the pilot classrooms, they actually found that centers worked better for them in the afternoons, and they did the literacy block in the mornings. So totally up to you. This is just one presentation of a possible structure. But certainly you can see that the center time uses really that 90 minutes of time by the time you do the intro, kids are in centers, and you engage in the thinking and feedback. This schedule puts math next, then lunch recess, on to the literacy block with the phonics program, the stations, the small groups, then a break for specials, a 15-minute window for story acting, another half an hour for writing, and then it's the end of the day. So again, this is just one presentation of how you could organize the components, but there's a lot of flexibility to do that. And some of our teachers found that, you know, they have to play around with it a little bit to figure out what makes the most sense at different points in the day. So I'm going to pause for just a second to see if anyone has any questions to this point. That's a lot of information that I've shared with you, and you're welcome if you want to unmute. Everybody feeling like they are getting their questions answered so far? Okay, so we'll continue on. As teachers are setting up their classrooms, environment is really important in being able to engage in the various components within K4Me. A lot of teachers, kindergarten teachers, might say, having those that have used K4Me, that it's a little bit like thinking about the structure or environmental design in pre-K classrooms, and that you have to plan for those centers center experiences. So as we take a look, you'll see some photos on the next few slides that will give you an idea of what some of those learning spaces might be able to look like that are set up for children. And one of the things we know about the physical environment is how that's structured says a lot to kids about the kind of learning, the way in which they'll communicate, the kinds of relationships that children will have with one another. And we know that really well-organized classrooms help kids use space efficiently. It allows teachers to have those interactions with children, allows kids to be more self-directed and self-reliant, attend for longer spans, and to be able to engage more purposely and intentionally. A few of the pieces that kindergarten classrooms may need to think about in adopting the program. Obviously, there are the books that really drive the curriculum. But in addition, when building out the center spaces, your kindergarten classrooms probably have a lot of the materials that you need already, a lot of the furniture, tables, library spaces, probably listening centers, those kinds of pieces. But you may need to consider some of the materials needed for the art center, like an easel. Certainly the block center is one that you may or may not have at this point in your kindergarten classrooms, as well as equipment for dramatic play, because that's another really important center. So those might be some of the areas that would need some investment to build those centers out, in addition to the texts that are needed, and then some of the other materials that have to do with science projects and just restocking materials. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So for schools that are interested in thinking about adopting or trying out Kindergarten for Me, the Department of Education this summer is going to offer a 2-day program introduction on August 11th and 12th. It's a 2-day training. You need to be at both days to take advantage of it. But in that training session, we will walk through all of these components, help teachers to understand how those unfold, really dive into Unit 1 of the program and help teachers to feel more confident with what that will look like. And then after the 2-day training, during the course of the school year in 21-22, we're going to be offering some professional learning communities for an hour each month to help provide a level of support to teachers who are using the program. And during that time, it will be a chance to delve deeper into the various components, to share work that's ongoing in your classrooms, to ask questions, to look ahead at the various units and do a little preview of units 2, 3, and 4 as they come up, so that you're getting some level of support and opportunity to talk with other teachers. I will say that in the trainings this summer, as well as in the professional learning communities, some of the teachers who've been part of the pilot are going to be presenting and helping with those experiences. So you'll have a chance to talk with teachers who have had some experience with implementation already and have a lot of good thinking and suggestions and that they can offer to each other. The other piece that I want to make sure to point out to you, because unlike Pre-K for Me that we already have posted on our department website, K for Me, because we are coming to the end of the pilot and are going to be making the final tweaks to the program over the next couple of months, we won't be able to post it publicly until the beginning of August. But that doesn't mean that there aren't places you can go to see the pieces now, because it's very much based on Boston's curriculum. And while there are some tweaks that we will have made to make it have a little more of a Maine flavor, the general curriculum that you see posted for Boston will give you a really good sense of what this looks like, how it plays out. So there are a couple of resources that I wanted to be able to take you to, so that you'll maybe have a place to go back to and delve in more detail. So I'm going to stop sharing the slides for just a minute and instead bring up the website so that you have a chance to see that. I'll give you a little orientation to Boston's website. So if you go to Boston Public Schools Department of Early Childhood, you can find all of their curricula for pre-K through grade 2. On the home page, a couple pieces that I would recommend spending a little bit of time engaged in. One of them is this video that's on the very top of the home page. Gives you a nice overview of their entire curriculum and kind of what's led them to this point. You can explore the principles that I mentioned earlier. And then as you scroll down the page, they have a lengthier video built for each one of the grade levels. So the one that you would want to watch for kindergarten is Focus on K2. That's what they call their kindergarten curriculum. And this video is very well developed and walks you through, and you can actually see inside classrooms exactly what those components look like and hear teachers talk about the components and how those unfold for children across the day and across the year. So this is one of the best resources for really getting to see what this could look like in action. So I would really recommend spending a little bit of time taking a look at that. Then once you've had a chance to do that, it will make a bit more sense when you actually go to the kindergarten link up over on the left-hand side. And this is where you can reach all of the actual curriculum materials that are available. And if you scroll down, you'll see that this year they've had a lot of resources for remote learning, because in Boston they have been remote the vast majority of the school year. But if you go to the resources section, that gives you a lot of the foundational documents that are good to dip into initially. You will find a pacing calendar, some of the assessments that are used in the Boston schools, some information about launching. That's a piece that we spend quite a bit of time on in the summer training, how you actually launch the curriculum. And then you'll get down to each one of the units, and you can see every one of the weeks for every unit, as well as home links, which are pieces designed to help families be able to connect and know what's going on in each week of the instructional program. And that goes on through all of the 4 units of study. Okay, I'll stop sharing for a second. So I hope that gives you a little bit of an overview of K4Me, and I'd love to answer any questions or things that you're thinking, wondering about.
Hi, Leanne.
Hi, Andrea.
How are you?
I am well. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. So I kind of saw this and came on my own. So admin and no one really knows I was looking into this. So my question is about the Summer Institute, because I don't foresee them having the money in my school to buy the materials for this upcoming year. would it still be beneficial for me to attend this summer, even if I wasn't implementing this at our school this coming school year?
Sure, I don't see why it wouldn't be. I mean, it would give you a really good grounding in the parts of the curriculum, and it would help you to be able to probably talk about it, think about it, know what you want to investigate more,
Okay.
be able to follow it. And you could certainly be a part, and are more than welcome to attend the professional learning communities to hear conversation next year too. I mean, obviously not teaching it will make it a little bit different, but hearing the perspectives of the teachers who are teaching it is always helpful. I didn't talk about this, but our larger goal with Pre-K for Me and K for Me is to keep going and be able to delve into focus on first and focus on second. Ideally, we'd love to be able to have open education instructional programs that are interdisciplinary for at least across second grade for schools to take advantage of. And so next year, one of the things we are going to do is have a PLC for first grade teachers who might be interested in focus on first and a pilot in the following school year. We had hoped to do that this year coming up, but with COVID, it has just been getting through the pilot for K for Me over the last 2 years has been, a heavy lift, and teachers have been incredible and very positive about what they see with their children. One of the things that we hear the most from teachers who've piloted the K for Me curricula is just how confident their learners are, how many fewer behavior issues they see in their classrooms because kids are so engaged and are directing much more readily their own learning. They're also seeing very strong growth in their literacy abilities because of the explicit instruction and the fact that the whole program is very language based. So that's been a real positive. In the pilot, we used the first year for the phonics program, we used Jolly Phonics because we wanted to make sure that it was an explicit approach that was manageable in the time constraint, or the time slot that's available. We also wanted to use something consistent across the schools for that first year of the pilot, just to make it a little bit easier for us managing a pilot. In the second year of the pilot, we had all of the classrooms that used Jolly Phonics the first year continued with it. We had about half of the other classrooms use that, and then about another half who used a variety of other phonics programs that were being used in maybe already in their school, or that we had one school that was testing out a couple of different phonics programs. It doesn't really matter as long as our recommendation would be that you use something that is systematic and explicit, has a scope and sequence, and that all kids are working through that experience, because you got to make sure that everyone's getting that instruction and that you're able to link it into the shared reading component of the curriculum. But certainly when we post the K for Me curriculum, we'll be clear that you need to add that phonics program, but we aren't going to say it has to be a particular program. I will say that the pilot teachers who used Jolly Phonics were pretty pleased with it overall, felt like it really helped their kids. And I think one of the things they would probably also say is just the systematic, explicit nature was really helpful for them, for their kids. And they saw a lot of growth happen. But there are different programs that could be used. In Boston, they use Foundations, and they use that across the board, kindergarten through second grade. So It's an adoption across the city. It's a little bit more pricey, and that was another consideration. I'll be very honest with why we went with Jolly Phonics. We had had to work within our means with our budget and wanted to find something that had a good research base, but was cost effective in terms of adoption. Other questions, other wonderings that people have?
One thing, Leanne, that I just wonder is how did things go this year with your pilot rooms with all of the adjustments that we all
Distancing, Mark, and the yeah, it was quite an undertaking, and I have to just give so much credit to the 28 teachers who continued on this journey with us, who had a smile on their face really the whole time we were working with them. They did fine. Obviously, centers were a little more daunting in a physically distanced world. One of the things that I think helped was that most of the school classrooms in the pilot were either operating in a hybrid model where they only had half of their kids there each day. So it kept the number of students down low enough that they could have kids in centers and stay physically distanced. So that made it a little bit more manageable. They also used some creative techniques, like sometimes they had portable center that they had kids bring to their own space and use. The part that I think was the most challenging and limited this year because of that were the interactions that you want to see happening between kids in centers, between teachers and kids in centers. It was just, that was a lot more of a lift. The other pieces of the program, they were able to implement pretty readily. And even the literacy stations, they could make that happen, or have kids bring the materials again to their desks. Yeah, so I can tell you, Mark, they are all very eager to get back to a more typical kind of an environment where
it was interesting to me to see, especially that group that did the first pilot, and then they did a second year with all these new adjustments.
Yeah, and they didn't give up. And we work with a consultant from the Boston Public Schools who has helped us to do the training and implementation of the pilots, and also is the one who's working with us to do the tweaks to make it have more of a main flavor. And she did, an incredible job this past year of helping build out resources that could be used for the distance learning pieces. So you saw a link that Boston had, and she would get those, tweak them for Maine, work with our educators. And our teachers in the pilot were wonderful about sharing with each other too. They would pass along materials that they had created that worked in Zoom world. And that's been a really nice piece of the project, is the relationships that have developed across the schools amongst the teachers who've been part of it. All right. So if you haven't seen the link, there is a link to register for the K4Me training in the summer. If you are thinking this is something you might want to adopt or do as a school, we strongly recommend that you come with a team of teachers and with an administrator if possible, so that they can learn right along with the teachers and be a strong support for teachers implementing. Additionally, if you're thinking that you're going to pursue the program, reach out to me, because I can give you the list of materials that you're going to need to have. I know that this is the time of the year where purchases need to get made, and certainly, it's not like you have to have purchased everything for the whole year at once, but you're going to want what's in Unit 1 for sure. And then some of those pieces that help you to construct the centers are going to be pieces that are going to be used the entire year. the pilot schools definitely found that having those on hand first and the materials for Unit 1 and even Unit 2 are good to have right off the bat. And then you can always order the rest of it later in the fall if you needed to. But I have a whole spreadsheet that I can provide that breaks down everything that you need. I will say that it is built from the concept of building a classroom from scratch. So don't let that overwhelm you. It's everything you'd need if you were to walk into a classroom and there was nothing there. You're going to have a lot there if you're already teaching and have a classroom outfitted. So you'll want to look for the pieces that you don't have and kind of tick off the ones that you already do. All right. So I know it's 4 o'clock and I don't want to keep anybody overtime. So if you've got what you needed, you're more than welcome to jump off. But if you have any more questions, I'd love to answer them. I know Nicole is also on. She manages our pre-K for me curriculum, and we're just so excited to be able to have a couple of programs that will be available to the field and to begin to build that alignment for kids.
So one question, Leanne, do you have any idea about what the average amount that schools actually had to pay for a classroom to get them up to kind of speed?
Yep. So if they had nothing, Mark, at all, it probably would run, like, I mean, I'm talking furniture, everything. Yep. It would probably cost them between $10,000 and $15,000 a classroom. But if you have a lot of the furniture and you're really looking to invest in the books, the general materials, and some of the centerpieces, it's probably going to cost you between $5,000 and $8,000 a classroom. On an annual basis, once you have all of the books and the basic outfitted classroom, it's about $500 a year to replenish the materials for each classroom, because there are definitely some art materials that will need to get replenished. There's also some science materials that are used for various experiments as part of the units of study, and those have to be like, there's an interesting one in the last unit of the year, Our Earth, where they're using earthworms, and you have to order those ahead of time and kind of have the station set up. So there's some pieces like that throughout the year, but generally once outfitted, it's not probably too much different than what you'd spend on a typical classroom on an annual basis.
All right.
Yep.
Thank you.
Sure. Anyone else wondering anything? All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, and don't hesitate to reach out with any questions or needs. Happy to chat with you more as you've had a chance to explore some of the resources and just be a thought partner with you.
Thank you, Leanne. You said you recorded this. Is there any chance?
I did, Mark. Yep. Yeah, I will actually stop recording.